it's a beautiful thing to be able to take a tragedy. We can't always control what happens to us, but we can control what we do with it, you know? And I think that's the beauty of the meaning making.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Midweek. This week, we brought back a familiar face, Suzie Lawyer. Thank you so much for being on here again. Thank you for doing another episode.
You're so welcome. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And the last time you were on, we did kind of a 30,000-foot view of faith and mental health, you know, how to take kind of a holistic approach to conversations about faith and mental health. And there was such like a great response from our community. And so this week I really wanted to start to dive in, you know, get lower down than 30,000 feet and take a look at a specific kind of mental health concern.
Okay.
And, you know, as you and I were talking kind of after, grief was just one of those for me that I thought, wow, it would be so great to learn more about and have a conversation about grief, especially ahead of the holidays, where I feel like those can be pretty triggering events, especially if we've encountered loss. And for a lot of people, this is the first year that maybe they're having a holiday without a significant person in their life.
Exactly.
And even if that event has happened years ago, that it can still be a triggering event. And still with COVID hanging over us and there's so much uncertainty, I feel like grief is a good place to start as we kind of dive into more of the meat about mental health concerns that we have.
Well, exactly. And if you haven't lost someone in your life, I mean, you probably will at some point. So it's something that everybody really has to deal with at one time or another.
Yeah, just good kind of preventative, care, preventative maintenance, as well as, hey, how do we kind of live with this?
Right.
Because it's one of those things that we'll all encounter grief at some point in our lives.
Exactly.
And the interesting thing is that it doesn't look the same for everybody, and there are different triggers. So something that might trigger grief in me might not trigger grief in you, and so it looks a ton of different ways. And so to kind of get into that, I think I'm really excited to do that.
No, I'm super excited. And when you just said that about grief being unique to the person, I read an article and they were talking about grief. Every person's grief is as unique as their fingerprint. And when you think about it, everybody experiences it just in a different way. So
yeah,
I like that little metaphor.
Yeah, that's good. So just kind of starting off, what is grief? I mean, I think it's kind of one of those words we use as a catch-all, but how would you help someone understand what grief is?
I think grief is what we experience after a loss. And it's kind of like the summation of all of the emotions that a person goes through after some kind of loss. And it doesn't always have to be the death of someone that is the loss. I mean, it could be a divorce. It could be the loss of a pet. It could be the loss of a dream. I know people who have experienced, like in the hurricanes or whatever, the loss of a home or, really anything. And that's where it goes back to grief being so unique, because what exactly that we were talking about before, like what might be a loss to you might not seem like that big of a deal to me. But if it's important to you and it was something that you lost that had meaning, then it's going to be significant for you.
Yeah. So. And then what are there like characteristics? I mean, I think it's pretty commonly known, like there are steps to grief. So like, what are those steps? And just kind of give us an understanding of like what is involved in the grieving process.
Okay. And the grieving process is just huge. So, and we'll kind of try to break it down a little bit today to help people understand it a little bit. So, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is kind of like the grief guru of the world. And what she did, she actually observed people who were dying and came up with these 5 stages of grief. And we've kind of, I think as a society, as mental health providers, we kind of now attach these stages to the people who are grieving the loss of someone else. So typically, based on her model, the first stage is denial. And so that can happen regardless of, most of my focus will probably be on death today. as one of the losses. But again, you can apply it to kind of anything.
Right.
But when someone passes away, usually that first stage is denial. And it's like shock. I can't believe this happened. Even if you knew it was coming, even if they were suffering with a long-term illness and you knew that their time for death was near, there's still the shock value of it all. And a lot of times we experience that denial. And it's interesting because that denial phase is actually really important. Because your body is in shock, you're able to kind of go through the motions of all the things that need to be taken care of right away. Planning the funeral, writing an obituary, notifying people, just doing all of that initial stuff. But it's great because you're in denial, your brain isn't able to really think about like, oh my gosh, what's my life going to be like in 2 years? Like you're not going there.
Yeah.
You're literally able to kind of see what's around you and deal with that in that space.
Yeah.
Which is actually really, really good.
Yeah.
And so the next phase, a lot of times people will move out of denial, and we'll talk about misconceptions too, because this sounds like it's very like
Right. Linear. Yeah.
Okay. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But then the next stage, I guess, typically we refer to as anger. So it's not that you've necessarily accepted it, but you've moved out of kind of that denial phase, and you can become kind of angry about what happened, and it's not fair, and I can't believe this happened to me. And just, I think typically what anger is, it's what kind of comes out when there's a lot of hurt underneath. And so I think that's what happens, that we experience this angry part of us that's really just trying to hold in all of the sadness, but it just comes out that way.
Yeah.
And a lot of times then people will kind of move then out of the anger into oftentimes kind of a depression. And I think that's where, all right, the anger's on the surface, and then all of those sad feelings kind of rise to the surface. And that's what kind of is seen by people. That's where you might notice like a lot of crying, a lot of not wanting to get out of bed, just a lot of just heaviness and just sad, just general sad.
Yeah. Is part of that like you come out of anger and you're angry because you don't understand, or you're angry? Does the depression then come because even through the anger you didn't get answers to those questions, like why did this happen, or what could have been different, what could I have done differently? Even if it's like a loss of somebody who they died at the end of a long life. Like I know I've had experiences with people who like then look back on their childhood and have like unresolved questions about their childhood and things. So, is that part of understanding like here's what's going on in the brain? Like we're starting to confront these questions.
Exactly. And I think you're spot on, right? And it's kind of like your eyes are opening, and you're kind of like, it's like a little awakening inside, like, oh gosh, this really is what's happening. And we also then talk about the stage of bargaining too, where it's like, you ask God, like, all right, what if I did this, or what if I had done this differently, or what if he had driven a different way home, and to try to kind of make sense of it, of the death, by asking all of these questions, like, oh, well, if I had done these right things and been a kinder person, then maybe my child wouldn't have died, or I don't know, whatever you're doing in your head to, again, just try to make sense of it all. And then the last stage is typically acceptance, which doesn't really mean like I'm okay with what happened. I'm okay that in my situation, I'm okay that my husband died. It's not that. It's my husband died and I'm going to be okay. And it's kind of coming to that place where it's the acceptance. Like, that there's nothing that you can do that's going to change it. It is what it is. And realizing that you can still hate it. It's still not what you would have chosen, but you're going to be okay.
Yeah. It's not the like getting over it that I think a lot of people associate with, like, it's like, okay, you have this time where you can grieve and then you just kind of get over it. The reality is you're never really over it. You just accept the reality that it exists.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And I think that's one of the things, people kind of behind the scenes, and they're watching a person who's grieving, and it's like, when are they going to be okay?
Yeah.
When are they going to be over this? And it's like, they might never be over it.
Yeah.
They just are getting through it.
Yeah.
And they will be okay. It's just going to look different.
And so when you're talking about seeing somebody who's grieving, is that always obvious? Like, can you tell when people are grieving? Does it have, there are the anger and the depression, but do you know that, okay, they're angry or they're depressed because they're grieving? Like, how do you differentiate between, okay, there's kind of a clinical depression or they're going through a season of grief?
Right, exactly. And you might not know.
Yeah.
You can always ask. And if you're aware that they've experienced a loss, then it becomes, I think, a little bit more obvious. But in situations where you don't know, someone new has started in your company where you work, and all of a sudden you notice a shift in kind of their mood and just kind of their whole demeanor. And that's where you would wonder. And I think people appreciate being asked, And this is something that I talk about a lot. Like, I think, and we'll kind of talk about too, like things to say to people and not to say to people in a little bit. But I think what's important to remember is when someone's lost someone, they're thinking about that person. They're thinking about their person all the time. And they want to talk about their person. And other people around are typically uncomfortable bringing it up because they don't want to upset the person who's grieving. And it's like, go ahead and ask. I think they would appreciate being asked because they're already thinking about the person anyway.
Yeah. When we're talking about the stages, you kind of alluded to it. What are some of the misconceptions that when we look at grief or we talk about grief, what are some of the things like, oh, you should be over it by now? Or
Well, I think, first of all, a huge misconception, there is no timeline for grief. What could take me 10 years to grieve might take you 2 weeks to grieve. It just depends. And oftentimes, I've read a lot too about this. It's like the depth of the love for the person oftentimes indicates the depth of the grief that you're experiencing. And so there's no timeline. It's also, those stages are not linear. So I gave you the 5 stages, but that might not be the right order.
Right.
There's no order to it necessarily. Typically, denial is the first stage, and typically typically acceptance is the last stage. But the things in the middle can be all over the place, topsy-turvy. There's no right or wrong answer for that. And just because you experience, the denial in the beginning, you might experience it again a couple months later. So you can experience those different stages way more than one time in different orders. And then within each stage, there's no prescribed time. And some of the stages can overlap. Like, you can experience denial and be angry at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's not just like you're checking off all these boxes to get to the, I've arrived and I'm over it now.
Yeah. Because even once you get to, this acceptance part, like you said, it could still be years later and something triggers the grief. And so you kind of relive that. You 100%. Feel that all over again. Mm-hmm. And I know for me, especially like early on in my own like mental health journey, having this, like, I thought I was over it.
Yes.
Feeling, and almost feeling like guilty or like I was just broken. It's like I thought I had already done the work to get over this, but there was really no getting over.
And it's kind of like an onion. You know how you peel the different layers. So layer 1, someone passes away, and you peel off all the layers and you deal with it, and you think you're over it, and then you might hear a song on the radio, and that takes you down to the next layer.
Yeah.
And then you realize there's another layer there. And then, your best friend's, someone that they care about passes away. And then that reminds you of how you felt. And that's another layer. And our bodies are just so like sensory aware that smells and sounds and sights and the way things touch, like, can trigger those responses too. And, just can add to like another layer.
Yeah. I don't know if it's a misconception, but as we're talking, one of the things I was thinking about is Something that I learned about recently, especially when COVID first started, was anticipatory grief.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about what anticipatory grief is?
Yes. Okay. So anticipatory grief, typically, like when we're talking about it, like in the mental health community, a lot of times it's when someone is diagnosed with something and you're anticipating their death. And so you're like pre-grieving, like their passing. And I think that it comes up because you are doing a lot of the preparation, right? Like, okay, well, maybe we should look at that life insurance policy, or maybe we should start talking about how do we want to divide up, among the grandchildren or whatever, all of the things that we have stored or whatever. And it's thinking about what's to come and grieving that ahead of time, or at least getting the ball rolling to grieve about it ahead of time.
And for me, it kind of fits into the kind of misconception thing, because you might have those feelings, but having not experienced a loss yet, in a sense, like, why am I feeling this way?
Right, exactly. And it's just how our minds work.
Yeah.
Because we're so focused on making sure that our basic needs are taken care of, and that the basic needs of our closest loved ones are taken care of. And so then you have something, jumping in that's like out of the blue, a diagnosis or whatever. And so then automatically you're like, all right, how do I make all these preparations so that everything is okay?
Yeah.
And I think with that anticipatory grief too, people think, well, I mean, I knew she had cancer and I knew that she was going to pass away. The doctor said 6 months or whatever. And then they pass away and then they still go through all those stages of grief. Then it kind of jacks with their whole mind. Like, wait, I thought I grieved before, but it's like, no, you prepared before.
Yeah.
And now this is what you're dealing with.
Yeah. It's hard. It's hard to have that experience and to feel like, I go back to my own experience of feeling like guilty for, hey, I thought I already handled this, or I thought I already dealt with this. And for it to come back over and over again, or, I think it's very confusing.
I know. And I think like it tags onto kind of our conversation when we did the midweek a few months ago. It's like we have all these expectations placed on us by society and our own standards, like, emotions aren't okay, don't feel, conceal, don't feel. I mean, that's like the tagline in Frozen, whatever. And so then when we do, it's like we don't feel right about feeling, because it's like, I shouldn't feel this way. It's like, well, says who? Yeah.
And so when we think about grief, we think about, like, at least for me, I think about, a movie scene, funeral, or in the hospital, and there's a lot of sadness and crying. But one of the misconceptions is that's all that grief looks like. But
right.
We've talked about it before, how grief can show up in ways that we don't expect. So what are some of the unexpected ways that grief kind of manifests physically or emotionally?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, like you were saying, like the typical feelings are sadness, anger, all the basic things. But it's when stuff creeps in that you never expected that kind of literally floors you. One of those, I know for me, was jealousy, because it doesn't really fit into the stages of grief thing. And for me, losing my husband, like seeing other couples, I just felt jealous. And it's not that I wished that they would divorce or wished that somebody else would, lose a spouse, but it just was like, you just wanted what you couldn't have anymore.
Yeah.
And so it was this envy feeling, this jealous feeling. And then the guilt, comes in, because you're like, I shouldn't be feeling jealous. They have a happy marriage and I'm happy that they have a happy marriage and I'm happy that they're a wonderful couple. But it's like, I want what I can't have anymore. And and I think you have to process that. And that, again, cracks that onion open again. And you've got to kind of explore, another layer for that. Another, I guess, unexpected emotion is kind of this clinging emotion. And it's where you feel like if you can have like still like one of the like belongings of the person who passed away and you don't want to part with it. And again, there's no timeline on that. It's not like someone says, well, they've been gone now for 3 weeks. It's time to, clean out their closet or clean off their desk or whatever. There's no right or wrong for that. But if you're just wanting to hold on to every little thing for a long, long, long time, that clingy kind of feeling is kind of like a surprise emotion, I think, that people don't really think about.
Yeah.
Also, the feeling of kind of being stuck, where it's just like, I'm going to feel like this forever. I'm going to feel like this forever. I'm going to feel like this forever. And when you're in the cycle of feeling so miserable, thinking you're trapped in there forever, and you're never going to get out of it.
Yeah.
That's a terrible, terrible feeling.
Yeah.
And I think for me, another surprise was just, I think, how easily things that you don't expect can be a trigger for you. So you can do all the planning, like Christmas is coming. So in your mind, you can think, all right, Christmas is going to be hard. It was the time of year when we all got together, and these are the traditions we had, and this is what we did every year. So like you could feel that, and you can think ahead like, wow, Christmas is going to be hard. But then it's the little things that you don't prepare for that just catch you off guard. And I think that's one of those feelings that you don't expect, something that's going to actually take your breath away that like you never would have imagined. So for me, I'll never forget, it was after Kevin died, and he was an orthodontist, and I had taken the kids just to get out of the area to an orthodontist in a different city. And we walked in, and the smell of that place took me back. And I'm sitting in the waiting room, and the tears are just like rolling down my face, because it was like the smell was such a trigger.
Wow.
Never could have planned on that happening.
Yeah.
Literally caught me off guard and took my breath away.
Wow. I don't know if this is real or not, so I'm going to ask you. But I was watching a show called Modern Family, and one of the characters, she like was at a funeral, and she just started laughing.
Yes.
And so it's like, is that like a real thing that happens where like your grief can show up as like, it wouldn't look like that person's grieving. It actually looks inappropriate.
Yes.
Given the setting. So is that, do we sometimes see like what we would consider inappropriate behavior, but it's still part of grief?
100%. Yeah. And I mean, if you think about like back to when you were in school, and if you got in trouble, you probably never got in trouble in school, but
yeah, never. No, never. Nope.
But like when you would get yelled at by the teacher, like you were so nervous and uncomfortable that you would laugh.
Yeah.
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 Or if you watch someone trip and fall, and then you start laughing, like you're not laughing because they got hurt. You're just laughing because it makes you feel like awkward. And so I think when people don't really have, I don't know, a box to put that feeling into, it just comes out. It can come out as anything, laughter or sarcasm or whatever. And it's basically just their way to cope with the feelings that they're having.
Yeah. Is that in any way, is that like part of the denial where like the brain is just kind of self-protecting in that moment?
I think so. It makes sense to me. I know just in my own story, it was the night after the visitation thing that we had for Kevin. And I remember being up in the hallway in my house with, I think, my mom and my sister, and we just started laughing, like uncontrollably laughing. And there was nothing funny. Like it was awful. But I think it was our way of just letting our bodies just like calm down again. Yeah.
It's the kind of built-in coping mechanism. And I kind of want to go into that next. Is like when we experience grief, there are healthy coping mechanisms, things that help us, to navigate our grief. But then there are things that are unhealthy. And so could you give kind of examples of both healthy coping mechanisms and unhealthy coping mechanisms?
Sure. I think some really healthy things to do. One is to get some therapy. I mean, and talk through the loss and your feelings, and just to have that person to just walk this journey alongside of you to provide support. I think that's like the best thing you can do. I think it's also another really healthy coping mechanism is to find people who have experienced something similar. So for me, it was finding a couple other widows who could relate, because while, I lost my husband, I never lost a child. So for me to try to share that pain with somebody else, it's a lot harder. So to find someone with like a similar grief, even though their grief is different, they kind of get you in a different way. So just any kind of even support group for that. Writing for me was huge. So I know I wrote letters to Kevin, I journaled, I wrote prayers to God, just getting those feelings out on paper. And what you do with the paper is your own choice.
Yeah.
You can burn it, you can rip it, you can save it for later.
I'd imagine something like that, like there would be a hesitation there because it's not necessarily going to feel good in the moment.
Not at all. No, it's not. And while you're writing and you can be sobbing or angry or whatever feeling you're feeling, but it gets it out of here and it gets it onto paper. So it just doesn't feel as heavy anymore. Rest is really important and eating well. I think that when we have that grief response and we're in that denial stage, especially when your body's in shock, it's like you don't want to eat. I remember trying to swallow a piece of food and feeling like I'm going to choke to death on this because I can't swallow right now. And, it's making sure that you're staying hydrated, that you're eating enough calories, that you're getting enough rest, because you need your strength to be able to take care of all the things that you need to take care of.
Yeah.
But maybe it's going for a walk. Maybe it's taking a bath. Maybe it's, going to get your nails done or getting a massage or just doing something to take care of you. Maybe it's doing something spontaneous and fun that is something that maybe you normally wouldn't have done. Obviously safe, but just something just to be a little bit different, just to kind of change things up a little bit. Reading something fun, not necessarily like self-help books on, how to cope through your loss.
Yeah.
Like nobody wants to read that. And sometimes, what's really healthy is sometimes having to say no. I remember people like wanting to flood the house after, and it just became too much. And I wasn't taking care of myself by letting all of these people in.
Yeah.
And so being able to put up some healthy boundaries to say, okay, you know what? If you're coming to bring me a meal, I love that, but you don't need to come in and talk to me for 45 minutes. When you come to drop it off. So, those are just healthy things to kind of put into place. Unhealthy things, it's funny because some of the healthy things can be unhealthy, right? So I have M&M's sitting here. So, eating, yes, is important, but if all I'm going to do is eat M&M's for 3 months, that's probably not going to be healthy.
Yeah.
It will get you through in the beginning, but long-term, that's not a good plan.
Right.
Having a glass of wine or something to calm yourself down is fine, but then making wine a regular part of your day to get through your day.
Right.
Same. I know a lot of physicians will prescribe like Xanax or something like that to kind of help you get through, those early stages. And it's like, that's, again, fine. You might need it, but to make that like a long-term thing might not be so great.
Yeah.
And sleep too. A healthy amount of sleep is important, but if you're discovering that all you want to do is be in your bed with the shades drawn and not get out, then that's not healthy either.
Yeah.
Because too much sleep ends up making you more tired and more, down, and then you don't want to get up.
Yeah.
So obviously, like anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's weird, for me that like there's times when like distractions are good and they're a healthy thing. So if like I binge something on Netflix, like that may be like a good distraction that my brain needs time to not think about, and not process certain things. Mm-hmm. But then, like you said, when that distraction becomes a routine, well, then I'm missing out. And really I'm not dealing with the grief.
Exactly. And I think that what we shove down eventually comes up in our responses and in our actions and behaviors.
Yeah.
It creeps up. So again, you're right. There has to be some kind of balance. Like, okay, go binge on a show. Like, that's awesome. Do it. But if that's all you're doing, then you're not dealing with what is right in front of you.
Yeah.
And it's going to show up again.
What are kind of some of the consequences of not dealing with the grief? The obvious, like, hey, it's going to boil up at some point. But are there kind of like low key or like low latency kind of things that happen? Is it distraction? Is it like, what are some of the effects of just saying, you know what, it's too much. I'm not going to deal with it. I just don't have time, or I need to get on with things.
I think you have a hard time then becoming an authentic person because you're not really living what you're feeling, you know? I think it impacts relationships then because you can't be real. And I think then you sometimes end up putting this protective guard up around yourself. And so then people can't get in to see the true you.
Yeah.
Because you're working so hard to protect these feelings that you don't want to look at. And they're just shoved down. I also think bitterness can grow. You're sad and you're angry that someone passed away and you're not going to deal with it and you're going to shove it down. Those roots of bitterness are just going to grow and grow and grow. And those roots are going to spread out into your relationships, into your work, into your, recreational life, like all of it, it's going to show up. And that's not healthy. Not to mention when we're working so hard, keeping emotions down, our body's stress response elevates because it knows there's something dangerous inside that we're afraid to look at. So then all of our cortisol levels are elevated, and that's not good. That's creating inflammation in our own bodies, which can lead to all kinds of health problems as well. And that's not good.
Yeah. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross comes up with the 5 stages of grief. And then a colleague of hers, David Kessler, who worked with her for years and years and years, identified kind of a 6th stage, kind of loosely a 6th stage of grief called meaning.
Yes, making meaning.
And so to me, that's the result, that's the end result of going through and processing your grief.
Right.
So if on the one end, if you don't process your grief, you have these consequences. If you go through and process grief at the end of that, I mean, I say at the end of that, but as you go through that, there's this meaning part. So what does that look like when you go through grief? What does meaning mean?
Right. Well, it's interesting. I love David Kessler. I took one of his classes and have read his books. But the whole meaning making is fascinating. So no one, for the most part, when you lose someone that you love so much, sits around and says, I'm really glad they're gone, And I think then what we have to do is we have to look at their life and look at how their life has impacted our lives. And to say, not what their death created in us, but what their life created in us. And so I look at, in my situation, my kids and me, we are the physical manifestations on earth to prove that Kevin was alive and a human being who had an influence on us. It's the way we think. It's the way we act. His life, how it changed us, how his life has, caused growth in us. And I think it's focusing ourselves on the impact that person's life had on us. And the great things about their life that not only had on us, but on the community at large or the world in general. And it's just a beautiful way, I guess, to honor someone's life and then also to honor how their life had a direct impact on us.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, it's such a big part of my own journey, having been through, I spent most of my 20s in psychiatric facilities. I'd have, visits that lasted from anywhere from a weekend to 3 months. I had a lot of treatment. Part of that was electroconvulsive therapy. I lost my long-term memory, lost short-term memory for a while. And so I grieved the person that I imagined I would be.
Yes.
I grieved the loss of that. And then I grieved the loss of my history. I lost a lot of childhood most of my childhood memories. Most things from my childhood I can't remember. And so there was grief in that. But then kind of going through that, the meaning part was then being able to see other people who were going through a similar experience and to be able to say, you're not alone. And here's what I've learned on my journey.
Right.
And so I found it to be real, this terrible experience to be so meaningful because I got to have relationships with people that I wouldn't have otherwise gotten to have, and to be able to understand people that I wouldn't have been able to understand.
Nope, I can totally relate to that. And I think about Like, I wish Kevin were here more than anything, but I mean, I said this last time, I love who I've become because of it. And it's a beautiful thing to be able to take a tragedy. We can't always control what happens to us, but we can control what we do with it, And I think that's the beauty of the meaning making.
Yeah. Yeah, that was like, I think right around that time I was starting to make meaning. I read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning.
Best book.
And that was like one of his, catchphrases kind of thing is like, we can't control the things that happen to us, but we can control what we do with them. And that for me was huge.
Exactly.
And because like in the grief, like you feel like power was taken away from you. Like something that I was my ability to control my universe was taken away from me. And so it's easy to miss like, oh, I have no control. Then I don't really belong here. Or there's a huge identity crisis. So then to realize like you do have a lot of control.
Right. Exactly. And we really only have today,
Yeah.
right? We're not promised tomorrow. And to take all that we've learned, all we've, discovered and make meaning out of it is huge.
Yeah.
And that's influenced by so many different things.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really great.
It's an amazing perspective and just lens to like look at life through, because bad stuff happens to all of us and we're grieving all kinds of things all the time. So if we can make meaning out of it, I hate to say it makes it worth it, but it kind of does.
Yeah. I mean, at least it's not all in vain.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Because there's part of it that's like, I mean, why did I even go through this? But then you see the relationships or the conversations that you're able to have. And it's like, okay, it still sucks that this happened. But at least it built something in me that I'm able to share with other people.
100%.
So, I mean, I think we could obviously spend a ton more time, talking about grief and diving into it. But I kind of want to finish with, on a practical level, when we see others who are grieving. I know for me, it's hard to know the right things to say. And there are times where I worry that I've said the wrong thing. So can you offer any advice on what to say and what not to say when talking with a friend or family member who's grieving?
And again, everybody's grief is different. So, preface it with that. But I think that so many people are so afraid to talk about the death of someone or a hard tragedy or something like that because they don't want to upset the person. And so they're very careful. And then they become so careful that it's like they just say stuff and they just start vomiting out words. And it's like, oh my gosh, like just be quiet,
Yeah.
But I guess some of the worst things you could say, I'll start with that. Some of the worst things you can say are things like, well, at least they're not suffering anymore. Okay. Well, they're not, but I am.
Yeah.
So that's not cool. Everything happens for a reason. Or when people are like, well, he probably never should have smoked cigarettes because that's how he got lung cancer. Or, those
kind of victim blaming at that point. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, that seems obvious not to say, but people still say it.
Yeah.
And just anything that makes the person feel worse, anything that starts with at least, like it just needs to be gone.
Yeah.
Just gone because there's no at least.
Yeah.
There's nothing that, that fits that. And I'm trying to think of other things that you shouldn't say. Call me if you need anything. Like, I know that it's genuine because you are wanting to like help and do something, but it's like the person who's grieving is not going to call.
Yeah.
That is not what they need to worry about. So what is helpful, I feel like it's tangible stuff, right? Hey, Brad, listen, I stay up late and I get up really early. So if it's ever, in those extreme hours and you feel like you need someone to reach out to, I just want you to know that I'm available.
Yeah.
Because it puts it out there like, okay, there's like a distinct, time that if I'm hurting, I know that I can reach out to you.
Yeah.
Anything like, hey, I'm going to bring you a dinner on Tuesday night and just do it and just show up with it. Hey, would it be helpful if I fill in the blank.
Yeah.
And don't assume they need you to mow their grass, and don't assume that they need you to come over and pull the weeds out of the garden. But hey, we've had great weather lately. Your grass is probably tall. Would it be helpful if I came over and mowed the grass for you?
That's a really good distinction. Just would it be helpful if?
Yeah.
It puts the ball in their court. They still have the freedom and the control.
Exactly. There. And again, if my grass needs to be mowed and I'm in the throes of grief, I'm not going to look through my phone and think, who can I call and help me do this? The grass is just going to keep growing and it's going to be a mess. So just, reach out in those kinds of ways. Also, I think sometimes the best thing to say is that you have no idea what you should say. Like, listen, I just want you to know, like, I don't have words. I just want you to know that I love you and I care. And I'm sorry that you've had to go through this loss. Stuff like that is just so helpful.
My biggest struggle is, when I know that somebody has encountered a loss and they've gone through a loss. Like, the question I always lead up, it's almost like a hello, is, hey, how are you doing? And I have no idea what a better alternative, like, greeting wise is. Cause I already know how you're doing.
Right. Your life sucks right now.
Yeah. Your life sucks. And it doesn't feel very good. And so me asking you how you're feeling doesn't feel good.
Right.
Even though I know that, I don't know the alternative of I always just want to say, hey, how are you doing? So is there could you give me okay, here's a phrase, here's a way to greet somebody whom you already know that they're going through something.
Right. I can't imagine how you must be feeling right now, but hey, if you want to talk, I would love to listen.
Yeah.
Gosh, so many people ask me how I was doing after, and I'm just like, how do you think I'm doing?
Right.
Like, I'm not doing okay.
Yeah, because there's a big duh sign.
Exactly. And I think it's just you asked the lady at Target how she's doing. It's just like the common lingo that we all say to people. But when you're in the throes of a deep grief experience, you want to punch the person when they ask you that. Like, you just do. That's not nice, but it is what it is.
Yeah, it's just how you feel. Yeah.
Yeah. And so sometimes just being like, I know you're probably suffering right now. Is there anything specific I can pray for? Because really, at the end of the day, there's really nothing that you're going to say that's going to erase their pain and take it all away. What they want, basically, unless you can tell them, hey, I can bring your person back right now, there's really nothing that you can say that's going to help them at all.
Yeah. And then I feel like also as someone who's going through grief, understanding that there really isn't anything anybody can say. So I know for me, I was looking for somebody who had the magic words. And it would even damage relationships on my end, because I'd say, well, I went to you for help and you couldn't help me.
Yes,
so what
exactly.
good are you? And I had that almost that anger of you couldn't solve it.
Yes.
But so for the one who's grieving to understand also, there's not going to be a magic word or phrase or sentence or prayer that is going to
erase it all and make it all better. And I think too, with that, I think people, they want to say something. And so they want to kind of share well, I've experienced a loss. So I'll just be like, oh, I know how you're feeling right now. No, you don't. No, you don't.
Yeah, at all. Yeah. That's the hardest one for me. When I hear is everybody, we all go through it differently. We all experience it differently. And like you said, with the support group, you can understand that people go through similar situations, but the way that you're processing it is totally different than how I might process it. Or the situation that happened, even though it's similar, it's not the same.
No, not at all. Not at all. And I think then too, people want to be cheerleaders, oh my gosh, you can do this, you can do this. And so they'll be just keep being strong, stay strong, stay strong. It's I don't want to stay strong.
Yeah, the motivational speaker.
Yeah, it's this pressure that it puts on you as you're grieving. And it's I can't. I'm literally doing everything I can to get up out of bed every day.
Yeah.
And be strong? No.
Yeah. And I'm not ready for the acceptance stage, basically. I mean, you're trying to get me through this process way quicker. And I still have some anger that I need to deal with. I'm still bargaining. I'm still in denial. I still have all this going on. So the motivational, meet me when I'm in the, in the acceptance phase, and I'm starting to build meaning out of this. But in that, especially initially,
Exactly.
That's the last thing I want to hear.
Yes.
You can do this.
Yes.
No, I can't. Tell me I can go watch Netflix and eat ice cream
all day.
all day.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know what else you can do too? And I mean, again, it's not something that you would say this to somebody random, but somebody that you already have like an established relationship with. Knowing that at first those basic needs are really important, right? Eating and sleep and all of that. So, hey, Brad, like I know that things are really hard right now, but I also know how important sleep is for your own health. How are you sleeping? You know, it's a tangible question that they can answer.
Yeah.
Instead of how are you doing? It's, so how have you been sleeping? And so they might be like, terrible. Like I can't, you know, the dog barks all night long and it's, you know, triggering me, blah, blah, blah. How about if I take your dog for the weekend so that you can sleep? You know, like stuff like that, that's like tangible, that's helping them meet their basic needs.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of, if you think of kind of that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you need that basic stuff first before you can even begin to start looking at like some of the emotions.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, before we close, is there anything, you know, if somebody's going through their own stages of grief right now, is there anything else that you'd want to add as far as like encouragement or, you know, instead of the, hey, you got this and you're, you know, kind of the motivational speech, is there anything that you would want people to know as they're going through that process?
You feel so alone when you're walking through the valley, the shadow of death, literally, but you're really not alone, you know? And the trite answers like, okay, God's with you. Yes, he is, but I don't feel it right now. But you're really not alone. And I think that in those moments of desperation, like there are people that you can reach out to get help and to get support. And I think that if you're watching this and you know of someone who is really hurting, be that person and step in. And you might not have all the answers, but there are places that you can lead them to find some help that they need.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of times just being there, like I know for me, I'm just being with somebody, just being in their presence and not feeling the pressure like I have to talk.
Yes.
Like if I have like safe people in my life where like if I'm going through something, I know we can just hang out and we don't have to talk at all.
I'm bringing the donuts and the hot chocolate and, you know, 4 videos from Blockbuster.
Yeah.
That's a joke because Blockbuster's not a thing anymore. But we're going to watch a Netflix and we're going to eat donuts and we're not talking. Here's a comfy blanket. Here's a comfy blanket.
Yeah.
Lights out. We're just going to watch a show.
Yeah. And it's oddly, like, I don't understand how it works, but it's so therapeutic.
It really
to
is.
have people who just like, I just want to be around you.
Yep.
And that's it. Like, you don't have to give me anything. You don't have to take anything that I have to give other than my presence. And so
No.
that's a big
And
thing.
there is so much research that just says that just like my presence and your presence, like together, it just like, it feeds the soul.
Wow.
It really does.
That's really good. Well, you know, thank you so much again for coming on.
I love it.
Again, we could talk for many, many hours, and hopefully you'll come back on again.
Yeah, I would love to.
Really appreciate you coming on. And the same, you know, kind of thing holds as we did for the last episode that we shot. If anybody has any questions about grief, or maybe you need resources for therapy, drop those in the comments, whether it's on Facebook or YouTube. We would love to be able to connect you with resources to help. We have our care ministry here at LifePoint Church. But any questions that you'd have, you know, I'll send them to Suzie and we'll post them back, or you can DM us or whatever.
Yeah.
But just please feel free to ask us any questions. And we would love to help any way we can.
No, for sure. And the holiday season we're right on the crest of it. So, I mean, it's going to be probably triggering for a lot of people. So
Yeah.
don't be afraid to reach out for help.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Hey, thank you.
Yeah.
Loved it.